Everybody, it's Larry Kotlikoff back with Economics Matters, the podcast. I'm here with Cliff Winston. He's probably our leading authority in our country on infrastructure. And I wanted to discuss that because I think it's a very important thing for everybody to understand what's going on, uh, especially in this political climate. Cliff is a is currently a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution. He's been at Brookings for a long time, since '84. So that, in my calculation, is 40 years. And he's an applied microeconomist. He specializes in industrial organization, regulation, and transportation. He's co-editor of the annual microeconomics edition of the Brookings Papers on Economic Activity. Prior to working at Brookings, he was an associate professor at MIT in their Department of Civil Engineering. He's the author of 17 books. He's got a brand new book, and one of them is, well, this he's got one that's called basically "Let's First Shoot the Lawyers," but the latest book is called "Revitalizing a Nation." It's joint with it's with you, Cliff Winston, and Gia John and Associates. And he's published extensively in top economics journals: the American Economic Review, Econometrica, Review of Economics and Statistics, the Bell Journal of Economics, Rand Journal of Economics. So for people that are familiar with economics journals, this is like publishing in Science or Nature if you're a scientist.
Mm.
These are the top journals in economics, not all of them, but basically the very top journals. And Cliff has also got a very fine education under the belt. He got his undergraduate degree at Berkeley, and then he got a master's degree at the London School of Economics, and then he got a PhD at Berkeley in economics in 1979. So, Cliff, welcome to Economics Matters. It's great to be back with you.
Great to be talking with you.
So, Cliff, I wanted to start out with you're giving us kind of an overview of the state of infrastructure in this country. You know, we have a lot of politicians passing some bills here and there. There's a infrastructure bill that was passed under President Biden. There wasn't an infrastructure bill that was passed under President Trump, as I understand it, even though there was a lot of attempts. But President Biden succeeded in having a bipartisan bill. There was a bipartisan uh, Inflation Reduction Act, IRA bill that has infrastructure components. And I guess my questions would be, you know, what's the state of infrastructure? We've heard from civil engineers reporting that it's just terrible. Uh, how much do these bills add to infrastructure investment as opposed to just replace what we were doing? Are they really a big deal about nothing? Because that's typically my sense of what politicians do here, which is that they pass a bill for 5 or 10 years, then it runs out, and then they renew it, and then they describe it as a brand new bill. And maybe it's, as a share of GDP, smaller than we were spending even before. So let's kind of focus on those two questions. And then I have other kind of broad questions about what the structure of these two bills are, how would they change the nature of infrastructure for the better, for the worse, and in particular, how how do these bills really matter to our trying to reduce emissions and to combat from our side in the U.S. Climate change, and we're still probably the second largest emitter of carbon dioxide in the world. Anyway, take it away.
Okay. So there was your first question was the state of infrastructure. What is the state of infrastructure? So probably anyone watching this or who follows at all has their knowledge, if you will, on the state of the infrastructure from engineers who, grade the infrastructure and give it a letter grade, usually a low one. Um, Now, this is a key part to much of what I'm going to say, in that engineers have dominated a lot of the public discussion and thinking about our infrastructure. You don't hear economists grading infrastructure, right? You don't really hear economists all that much in the forefront of what to do about it. So, what I'm really talking about is a mentality toward infrastructure that has existed in this country pretty much since its founding, and that is the engineering mentality of building, of spending. That's how we think about infrastructure. Now, when the country began, sure, we didn't have anything, so it made sense to start building and constructing. But now we have much of the system is built. No one denies that. No one is talking about, oh, we have to build a whole new interstate highway system. System is largely built. So the real question is, how about making the most efficient use of what we have? As opposed to simply thinking spending, 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 let's think about efficiency and how can we do that? Once we start having that perspective and get away from not only spending, but just a lot of the inefficiencies that people observe about infrastructure, congestion, pavement damage, sometimes safety issues, what have you, that then pushes engineering out, puts economics in. And that's really the thrust of a lot of what I do and what transportation economists do, to think in terms of efficiency, which does not call for massive spending, all right, but to use the basic principles of economics and weave efficient pricing with efficient investing. That is, you really can't think about investment until you get the prices right.
So
Right.
an example
Yeah.
might
So
be,
that's the basic theme of really how I'll
right.
think about it.
So an example might be if you have a road and it's being deteriorated, undermined by super heavy trucks, uh, and then maybe they're all driving at the same time. If you put on uh, pricing that says that uh, if you put on extra weight, you have to pay extra fees because there's also railroads that you can use. It might be for shipping the products, do less damage to the highways, and then we don't have to be constantly repairing them. So here, I mean, when you say that we have safety issues, people immediately say, well, we have to fix those. But what you're saying is we're causing the safety issues by the way we're using the infrastructure. So we have to be not just fixing things, but also changing the way we use things so that we don't have to fix them again right away. Now, how bad, just generally speaking, if you didn't uh, if we just think about at this point in time, I've seen reports by engineers suggesting that like half of the U.S. infrastructure is kaput. It's really in terrible shape. It needs to be fixed. Are things in terms of safety just terrible right now, or are the engineers just looking for jobs?
Well, remember, we're talking about safety. Now we have to be specific, right? For the most part, we're not going to have sort of it's not like airplanes when they crash. That's a major safety issue in the country. You're not going to get, major safety concerns from going over a pothole,
Right.
right? So, most of the roads, to the extent that they're not in great condition, it's potholes.
Right.
Where you have concerns about safety, it's on bridges. And if you have what is known as catastrophic failure, the bridge collapses and there are a bunch of cars on it, yeah, that's a scary thing. Now, fortunately, we don't have that too often. That's very rare. And at the same time, I think what engineers are calling attention to is when they inspect bridges, they'll see cracks and they'll say, oh, catastrophic failure is right around the corner. And that's sort of the kind of thing they're talking about. Now, look, you observe as much as I do how many bridge collapses we have, not too many. So it's not, quote, that bad. But at the same time, it wouldn't be a bad idea in the same way we think about pricing to deal with congestion and pavement damage, to start thinking about pricing in terms of bridge damage. And then again, the idea is to coordinate that then with investment. So we don't necessarily have to go out and spend a fortune uh, fortifying bridges, right? You can cut down on that if you have pricing which discourages the kind of truck combinations and weight that are what are damaging the bridges. So if we have less of that, then we don't have to spend as much on investment rehabilitating the bridges, and of course then discouraging them, from doing the damage they do.
Are we having enough inspection? I'm sitting here in Providence. I teach at Boston University, so I have to commute, but we moved down during COVID to Providence to a lovely 304-year-old house built 5 years after Louis XIV died. So it's really a cool little house. Um, and there's all these people commuting uh, the from basically the east, from Massachusetts. They're traveling west to Providence, and there's a bridge over the Providence River, which half of which just was shut down because there were bolts that snapped. Uh, and I'm wondering whether, how this can happen that, uh, and of course, it's causing huge kinds of problems, destroyed lots of uh, business during Christmas. People were not able to come into town and go to the restaurants and go shopping in Providence because there were hour long. I think some people were commuting for 4 hours each way. When this first started, they found some alternative routes, but basically it's a big mess and it's going to take a while. How is it that this doesn't get figured out, like, ahead of time? I agree that if we had prevented heavy trucks years before using with their overuse of that bridge, we wouldn't be in this boat. But how is what on the inspection side, are these things just not uh, discernible in advance, or should the bolts be replaced periodically? I mean, going back to the Max 737, right? That just where a door just fell right out of the sky, and fortunately nobody died out of that Alaskan airline. But now Alaska Airline is pretty much out of business for quite a while until people basically, you know, replace until Boeing fixes these doors in a way that's quite permanent, and people are confident again to get on those planes.
Yeah, so I think you put your finger on it. You may not realize it, but you did. There's a big difference between Alaska Airlines and the Rhode Island Department of Transportation.
Mhm. Right.
One is the public sector, one is the private sector. Generally, airline safety in this country is amazingly safe. We have not had a major commercial crash of a major carrier, for more than a decade now. Uh, so things are safe, but at the same time, and the obvious reason is they have an incentive to be safe. And if they're not, as we see, wait a minute, did I do something to the?
I think you just got rid of your picture.
Oh, sorry. Oh,
There you
there we go.
go. Yeah, no problem.
If there's a problem, there are consequences for the private sector, and they know it. And so Alaska's feeling it, and Boeing's going to feel it, and United is feeling it. So, this is a hard problem. They have policies in their companies about checking things and safety inspections and all that sort of stuff. But,
Mhm.
they're not perfect. They make mistakes. And when they do, they pay the consequences, and they're not going to make this mistake again. Public sector is not it's not the same. Who's really going to bear the mistake when all of a sudden someone discovers that a bridge has got some bolts loose on particular sections, and it's going to delay traffic? Well, who are the people going to scream at and say, fire them or give me money for all the time I have in computing or commuting? No one. I mean, the public sector will say, we're doing the best we can. We're going to check this. We're going to close it, and we'll get back to you. And so, that is one fundamental issue also about transportation. I'm mentioning sort of an engineering mentality. There's also a very significant role of the public sector, who does not have the same incentives for efficiency as the private sector. And there is a big part of your problem.
So I guess there are economic solutions for basically privatizing bridges or highways, or at least the maintenance of bridges and highways, such that if a company would stand to lose their contract or pay penalties if something like this happened. Is that kind of what you have in mind?
Yeah, I mean that's sort of in general, and this is sort of what we'll talk about a bit about my book that I want to go is getting a greater role for the private sector in doing these things, where obviously we can also have competition. Now, highways are probably the last on this list because there are concerns with how we would design, a private highway system where we can compete. But that's certainly something that's increasingly motivated when we have problems with the system in terms of its repair and just an inability to deal with basic issues such as congestion, then
Okay.
it comes up, couldn't the private sector handle this?
Right. So let's turn to the issue of expenditures in as a share of GDP. If we think about infrastructure in the post-war, once the big investments were made. So if we look at last maybe 20 years, uh, do these two new bills, the infrastructure bill that was passed under President Biden, the IRA bill, uh, the Inflation Reduction Act, and these were bipartisan bills, which not easy to make happen these days in such a divided Congress. Uh, but do they really add materially to the ratio of infrastructure spending to GDP, or are they just replacing spending that came to an end? Uh, was this whole thing a hoax
All right.
for the American public?
Yeah. All right. Let me continue with my contrarian perspective.
Go for
The
it.
dependent variable should not be infrastructure spending divided by GDP. That
I
is a
know, I know.
mistake. No, and I'm not blaming you. No, this is, again, a particular perspective that now this time economists got to take a little hit here. This is something that was very big in the macro and public economics literature. All right. But think about it. All right. The way the bills work, and this is the way the country was willing to do this, is the money has to be doled out across the country. It's not efficiently provided spatially to the areas with the biggest congestion or pavement damage or whatever. So everybody has to get in on it. So, intuitively you can see, well, just because I, give North Dakota, Wyoming, Alaska, you name it, billions of dollars, it's hard for me to say that I'm really doing a lot to improve our transportation system. And when people sort of say, oh, we can get a real great payoff in productivity, as they did from increasing spending, then you ask, okay, what exactly is the mechanism that you're going to really increase spending by paving over Montana, right? Or productivity by paving over Montana. So intuitively, you can sort of see that has been a problem in and of itself. The issue is what is efficient spending, right? And there, that takes us back to cost benefit analysis. And then it takes us back further. Before we do efficient spending, we got to get the prices right. So all this goes back to the same theme that I'm saying is key for transportation economics. Don't look at outright expenditures. That's the wrong dependent variable. The right dependent variable is economic welfare, right? That's what we want to
Okay,
maximize.
so just tell me, just for my
Yeah.
own interest, I realize that this might be a bad measure, not a bad thing to know that infrastructure spending as a share of GDP is higher than it was in the past, but is it higher under these new bills as a share of GDP?
It'll increase it, but it's not. My understanding is actually the federal government has cut back in its contributions, and you have spending at other levels too, state and local spending. So they're going to have to sort of make up the slack, if you will.
So that might
Um,
actually go in the direction of what you're saying, which is that
yeah,
if Montana realizes that just putting another highway through Montana that nobody drives on is not the best use of funds versus, spending them on pre-K education, they
right.
spend the money on pre-K education.
Now, if they can get the federal government, don't get the wrong idea, if they can get the federal government to give them money to pave
Sure.
over a highway that no one uses, they're not going to say no, don't do it. Because usually those are earmarked for that purpose. They'll take it. Now, it won't do much, but they're not going to turn it down. But if the federal government says, no, you've got to spend your money, raise money, taxes or whatever, and spend it on highways, they'll say, maybe not. Maybe we don't want to do that and think
So,
of other things.
so in these new bills, so now let's talk about kind of the way these bills were structured. Is there anything really importantly new about how they were structured such that we can think that there'll be more efficient use of these dollars down the road, or was it kind of same old, same old?
Same old, same old. I mean, if there was a change, then it would have been, quote, prudent for the administration to announce, we're going to do things differently. And here's how people have done it in the past and why that's inefficient. Here's how we're going to do things to make things more efficient. But that's not what was done. It's basically still about let's provide dollars, maybe more than we had in the past, under the guise of stimulating the economy. That's in one part of the bill, and then a different part is okay. Let us now, again, raising the question of what the public sector is doing, getting involved in this to try to promote the adoption of electric vehicles. That's another chunk of money that's being provided through the bills. But in the infrastructure part, there was one thing that was new in that buried in the bill was a program to actually test the kind of pricing I'm talking about. So there was a sort of codicil, if you want to put it that
The
way,
vehicle
of having
mileage,
what is known as a VMT, vehicle miles travel tax, just
right?
to test it. And that's exactly the kind of tax we should have. And interestingly, the states are doing that. The states are the ones who are exploring that tax, but this would be the federal government doing a similar thing. But as far as I know, that hasn't gone anywhere. But at
So,
least they mentioned it, which
so
is
the
something
idea
that
would
had
be if
not
you're
been ever mentioned before.
the idea is if your truck, if this particular truck travels twice the amount of miles in a given year than that truck, uh, and the weight is also, let's say, adjusted for weight, uh, they're going to pay twice as much in whatever highway fees for driving over
So
the.
the broader idea is this. There are a number of externalities that automobile truck travel cause. And the idea is to charge people for their contribution to those externalities. So one of them is congestion, one of them is pollution, one of them is pavement damage, one of them is fuel consumption. So the idea is to have a tax per mile, but is ideally adjusted to account more precisely for all those externalities and then discourage people from either traveling at peak periods, if it's the congestion part, from using trucks that cause great damage. And let me be quickly clear on that. It's axle weight. So it's actually the real killers out there are cement trucks with two axles. In other words, the axles are good in the sense they balance out the load. So there's less pressure on the road cracking it. All right. So it's good in some ways to have more axles even out the load. So the idea would be to have a tax that encourage truckers to put on more axles so they don't damage the road so much. And pollution, same thing. So with modern technology, we can actually set such things and monitor vehicles. People scream about privacy, but it's sort of hypocritical. In a world of iPhones, we know where you are and where you live. So don't worry about that anymore. We'll find you if we need to.
So
And so we can, sorry?
is California trying this out? Is that part of what? Okay.
They're interested. I mean, there are a number of states, as you might expect, more on the east and west than other parts of the country that are exploring testing this. Oregon was the leader, if you will. I think they did one of the first ones and
Hmm.
had people actually participate. But there's sort of growing interest in doing this kind of thing as an efficient way to
So
raise road revenue.
on that the part of the bills, you say basically it's same old, except that there's this uh, vehicle mileage adjustment tax option.
No, just a money to experiment. They're not even committing
From
to anything.
experiment. Okay, so we
Yeah,
got
just even sort of look into it. Look into it. Think
we
of
got
it that way.
that cool provision,
Yeah,
but it's a small part of the whole thing. Uh,
right. Oh, very
then
small.
also have some focus on electric vehicles, and I guess we're talking here about charging stations.
Well,
And
both. Certainly, subsidies
yep.
still exist. So we want to continue to have the high subsidies for EVs, provided, remember, there are no components in the vehicle from China. You're not going to qualify if you've got an EV that's got components from China. Other than that, you're fine. So and remember, the states are doing this too. So you can get a federal subsidy and a state subsidy to purchase an EV. So that's one part of it. And then the other part is they want to have money funded, billions of dollars, to build a network of charging stations. Now, again, back to the theme. One is aware, hopefully, that the private sector is also constructing charging stations. They have obviously huge interest in doing this. I mean, think about it. I mean, the gas companies know that the future is not with gas, right? They know that. Where are they going to be? I think they might want to be with electric. And they themselves have charging stations. Places like Starbucks think, hey, that would be good. Let's have some charging stations. So people come use us. They can also park their car, get the thing charged up, have some coffee, and then go out and do what
So
they're
how
going to
much
do.
has this happened? Well, first of all, I've heard reports that not a single charging station has been erected by the federal government under this, or the states under these new bills. Not a single one in like a year and a half, 2 years since they've been passed. I have a plug-in hybrid with my wife, and I can't find any place to plug it in. I go to a local gas station. I don't see chargers there. And then the ones I guess there's been one near my kind of WeWorks office down here in Providence, which took forever to charge and cost an arm and a leg. It just doesn't seem like things are happening. And when then we also, I just read, I think yesterday, that Hertz rental car was going to try and sell something like 200,000, maybe I got this wrong, Teslas, in order to get the money to buy gas combustion engine cars because people did not want to rent uh, Teslas as they had expected, I guess because of the charging issues. But Tesla, of course, has a network of charging stations where you can charge pretty quickly. So what's the kind of charging story here are we about to see this all come on board? Uh, or has the whole thing been a disaster?
Um, it's totally misguided. I mean, the fundamental question that should have been asked by the government is what's the market failure that requires us to intervene in spurring the adoption of electric vehicles, and as part of that, building charging stations. What's the failure? And this is the new part that I'm trying to push. What are the chances that whatever market failure there is, the government failure, that is our inability to implement a good policy, will lead to costs that are greater than the market failure? Right? That really is now the way we've got to think about public policy, which we have not been thinking about. So if you start with that framework, you realize, look, the market is evolving slowly on the private sector side. The companies know that. What the share may be about 9%. now of new vehicles or electric vehicles, with Tesla leading the way. The largest sellers of EVs in the world are kept out of our market. That is Chinese, with what is known as the BYD, Build Your Dreams electric vehicle. You can't buy that here. Um, so, the private sector is doing things, but it's slow and probably appropriate. For the most part, EVs have been purchased by more affluent people on the coasts. And as you say, there are chargers, certainly if you're going to get Teslas, that they can get. And a lot of people, which I assume this is what you do, charge their vehicle at home.
Yes. Mhm.
So, if you drive around Silicon Valley, you look for charging stations, you'll see them, but nobody's using them because they're charging their vehicles all at home. That's what a lot of them do. So, anyway, I mean, the private sector is moving along, not fast, but probably appropriate given consumer interest in this. And the same thing with probably the evolution of charging stations.
Well, isn't it kind of chicken and egg if we had charging, if every gas station was required, let's say, and compensated and told you have to have a charging station uh, uh, implemented by this date in a year, uh, couldn't that just revolutionize the entire situation and make everybody keen on buying electric cars, right? And make that 9% go up to 25% overnight?
So, this is what you're describing is a classic problem in transportation where you, in many ways, have to commit your capacity before you really know demand. Okay. So airlines are classic, right? The airlines don't know exactly how many people are going to be out there when they set their schedules, right? They have to commit and say, well, we're going to offer these many flights a week to these destinations, and we're going to use these planes. And demand is yet to materialize,
Right.
right? And so then they iterate, and sometimes flights are moved around and all this kind of stuff. But they have to solve this problem. That's what I'm getting at. And this is the same thing. They have to worry about what kind of capacity in terms of charging capacity do we want to provide to interact with purchase and use of electric
So
vehicles. And that's just
suppose
a problem they've got to solve. That's what I'm saying, is they've got to do that. And so my point is, do you think the government can solve this better? Right. That's
well,
the issue.
well, I want, but we look around at the private sector and they're not solving it on their own. Maybe they're waiting for the government. Maybe that's part of the problem.
Remember, the government's intervening. I mean, they have no, in some sense, the private sector would say, well, why do we spend our money on this? If they've got $5 billion in new legislation to build charging stations, let them do it.
So why hasn't, okay, so a couple of questions.
Yeah.
First, why hasn't it happened so far? They've got the money. Why haven't we seen any charging stations being installed? Is this just incompetence at the Department of Transportation, or where's it coming from?
Well, you've got two ends of it, right? You've got the spending end, right? Somebody said, let's start writing checks. But then it's not clear to me that along with the quote spending end, there was the implementation end where it was clear, oh, here's how we're going to do it. And here's the process that we're going to use. Remember, this is going to be not charging stations in DC that they completely control, right? These will be charging stations throughout the country. So you've got to then get the states involved. Well, already some states said, we don't want the money. We don't want to be setting up all these charging stations. We need land for that. We have enough for, quote, our purposes, so on and so forth. Again, it's a coordination problem that is here. And again, no one's working on it. And it's, again, not even clear that there's any point to doing it
Is, okay, so here,
from the state's perspective.
this brings me to my second question, which is, let's say you were dictator for on this issue.
Right,
You know, uh, Now you're fully in charge of
right.
federal EV policy, even state EV policy. and private, you can basically build a EV charging station anywhere you want, uh, at any time. You can do it overnight. You can do it slowly. What would the world look like a year from now if Cliff Winston was in charge?
Well, wait, if I'm in charge, I'm going to provide incentives for people to get electric vehicles by putting in a VMT tax with a nice hefty emissions charge to it, right? That's what we want to do. In other words, again, people lose track of what the problem is we're trying to solve.
Okay, so you're saying that there's
The
no,
problem is pollution, right? Emissions,
no, no, no.
climate change, all
I got
that.
it. I got it.
That's what we want to solve.
I'm with you 100%.
And we need to set prices on what the social costs of these are.
You got to
And
focus
then you
on.
do that, and then people say, wait a minute, I think I'd like to reduce my emissions payment when I use my car. I can use an electric vehicle and I can cut it down substantially. That's the idea.
So give people the incentive but is there some, okay, let's say we had the right tax and incentive uh, system in place. You would put that in place day
Right.
one. Now, day two, is there some uh, public goods nature to this issue of charging stations that we need to have? Uh, is there some externality associated with building a charging station, positive externality that the private sector would not necessarily capture, or do you not see anything like that? Do you think that the private sector, with the right, uh, let's say, tax per, uh, let's say, carbon tax, if you like, let's think about it that way,
Sure.
with the right carbon tax uh, on all uses of carbon, anything that was going to emit carbon, we had everything properly priced. Would uh, the charging stations take care of themselves properly, or do you see that there's an extra role for government intervention here, that there needs to be additional subsidies for or direct installation by the government of charging stations?
No, I don't see
You don't see
any
anything.
any role for the government in this. Now, again, let me go back to what I said.
And let me
I'm not
just
going to
remind everybody.
guarantee that the private sector will develop a fully efficient charging station network. Again, they'll touch the waters and they'll try to see how shall we evolve both capacity is with demand efficiently, but there'll probably be mistakes. But whatever mistakes there are, trying to say that the public sector is going to come in and do better and not have a lot of inefficiencies like we've seen already, we have no idea what they're doing, is crazy. I mean, this is just not the kind of thing they should do. Now, we have seen this again in other infrastructure. That is, if you look at how we fund the highway system, if you look at how we fund the airport system, there's a lot of money, but it's not doled out efficiently. As I said, the money is not directed to where the social costs are highest, right? You're still getting states that have very little congestion getting a lot of money. You're getting airports that have very little traffic getting a lot of money. There's just a huge amount of waste. And that is exactly the kind of problem with having the government involved in really a public infrastructure project because they're going to waste a lot of money. And that's something that, ideally we're going to cut back on that because there's opportunity cost of this money.
Okay, so I want to remind everybody that this is Cliff Winston. I think our top infrastructure economist in the country, and he's at the Brookings Institution. He may sound like he's right of center, but he's not political as I've known Cliff for a long time.
Yeah.
He's just common sense, what economics brings to the table. We have to remember we have 535 members of Congress. Not a single one has a PhD in economics. Uh, I want to move quickly to your book, your new book, right? It's called Revitalizing America's, let's see, it's Revitalizing a
The
Nation,
nation.
Competition and Innovation in the U.S. Transportation System. It's a Brookings Institution Press book. It's available, I presume, on Amazon. So let me just repeat: revitalizing a nation, competition and innovation in the U.S. transportation system. So, Cliff, tell us, let's say that either President Biden is reelected or Nikki Haley becomes president, and you become Secretary of Transportation. Uh, well, tell us about your book
Uh,
in the context of also this fantasy of your actually having the ability to implement things.
okay.
Let's tell people about the book first
Okay.
of all, so that
Let me start though again with some motivation. I think this is often the big problem in so many policy discussions and even especially involving transportation. What are we trying to do? Right? Before I start talk about solutions and what we're trying to analyze, what is the big picture question? Okay. Transportation involves trying to minimize, if not reduce, what we call the full cost of distance. All right. The fact that we're not living in caves close together, right, generates costs and benefits. Now, the cost of distance is obviously out of pocket costs. You want to go from Providence to Boston, you got to spend your money on a mode to get there. But that's only one cost. Then you have to put your time.
Mhm.
You're putting your time into that trip, and there's often a distribution of time. You're not quite sure how long it's going to take. That's another cost. Okay. And if you're a shipper, you're tying up your capital and you're putting it on a truck or a train or whatever. And so you don't have your goods where they can be most ideally used and so on and so forth. That's your cost. And then, of course, safety. Things happen en route. So that's it. This is the full cost of distance. Now, this is a huge item. This is a big ticket item, but this is not something people talk about generally when they talk about the big picture of the economy, that we want to minimize the full cost of distance. And transportation is obviously the tool in which we do that. And in that sense, transportation is probably the most unappreciated input in economics. People say, well, we tend to think of producing things, you have capital, labor, so on and so forth, but you don't get any of that without transportation. Now, people will say, yes, but for transportation, you need capital and labor. True, but the reverse is still true. So, we start off with this big picture that transportation conceptually plays a fundamental role in any economy because it is used to address some really huge costs, time costs, out of pocket costs, safety costs. All right. So the name of the game then is, okay, how can we develop a transportation system that can most efficiently address this problem? Now, there are two parts to this. First, let's think about the system, the transportation system. And that transportation system is, well, urban transportation, we tend to divide it, geographically or spatially, and urban passenger and freight, intercity passenger, and then intercity freight. So those are sort of the components of it. It may not be that forever. I mean, this may be historical coincidence that's how we've thought about it. But as the world evolves, it might be different. But for now, that's how it is. So we start with the system looking inward, which is what transportation people have done, and think about, okay, what are the various components? Where are their strengths? Where are their weaknesses? Now, the second part, which I only touch on in the book, the first part the book really deals with this first part, the transportation system, its components, its strengths, its weaknesses, how we can make things better, where do we learn how we can make things better, so on and so forth. The second then is the bigger picture. Okay, now that we've done this, how does this affect the broader economy? All right, back to what I'm saying, the full cost of distance. So you can think in many ways of transportation as critical to macroeconomic policy because it affects all the sectors. You improve the components of the system, they're going to have spillover effects. Improving labor, trade, agglomeration economies, industrial competition, you name it. Because why? They all involve the full cost of distance. All right. So those are the big picture issues. And I'm sort of starting with the first one, my book, analyzing this transportation system, focusing on where things need to be improved, where things have been improved so we can learn from history, and then touching a little bit on these broader issues and moving eventually in another book to transportation and the whole economy. But we'll get to that hopefully. If I don't ever get COVID, which I never have gotten.
Well, bless you. Good, good. If you do get the Paxlovid, because I think it's worth it. Paxlovid. The
So I'm told.
yeah, the I guess the question would another connected question would be: is there any country that's getting this right? If
No. In a word, no. We don't have to look elsewhere. We know how to do it. We
okay,
can do it right.
so now concretely, you're Secretary of
Right.
Transportation under the next administration, and you have an agreeable Congress and an agreeable president,
Right.
and you're in charge.
Right.
What would you do? What are the 10 things you do?
All right. So the key, and this is what my book is about, is we have had improvements in transportation through two ways: competition and innovation. All right. That's what we need to stimulate, encourage, spur, what have you. That will help the system. So obviously, competition was spurred by deregulation. So that's the big success story. Um, it has been depressing to see these horrible op-eds about the problems with airlines and that we ought to re-regulate. It's scary that it's so hard to sort of get people to realize this is a success story, and Congress should be happy and take pride in what they did. Yet there's one problem, what problem comes up and people start screaming, we need to re-regulate. No. So there are other areas, though, where we can stimulate competition. Okay. So, for example, we do not allow foreign airlines to serve domestic routes. We allow foreign car companies from, let's say, Germany and Japan to produce cars and sell them in the domestic United States. However, we don't allow British Airways to serve Providence to Boston or Boston to Chicago, right? So that's one thing right there. How about getting some new competition, which to me is a pure winner for travelers, that's for sure. Obviously, the airlines may not like it initially, but move toward global deregulation, right? Which is, again, another unappreciated benefit. Many people travel internationally. You go to Europe and you want to go, let's say, Pisa, Italy. You fly to Rome. Then you got a 6-hour connection to get to Pisa. You got to use a different airline. We could develop with global deregulation seamless travel, where you have an airline saying, look, we want to provide the entire service. We want to take you to Rome. We want to hook you up with our smaller carriers and take you to Pisa on us and not make you wait 6 hours in an airport. That's just an idea of what can happen, but there's a lot more. All right. In the case of infrastructure, why does Atlanta have one airport? They have the busiest airport in the country, but there's only one. Why is it where I live, there are three airports, which is much smaller, and Atlanta has one? Why isn't there private airport competition? We could get that. It's crazy to think we couldn't. And there are many other parts of this country where there's just monopoly airports. Let's look at our port system. Our port system is actually evaluated by the World Bank, global comparison. We're always at the bottom. That is one area where you can at least look to other countries and say, look, their ports are open 24/7. They use more modern technology to automation and what have you to help. This is critical to the supply, the issue on the uh, supply network and supply issues, right? These public ports, and of course, you got longshore, what do I call it? Longshore people, not longshoremen anymore, longshore people. They're probably women who work there. And they get paid a fortune. That's a very lucrative job. Good 6 figures with a lot of benefits, right? It's very costly. They're like the old days of the $300,000 airline pilot or more. All right. They can compete. Why can't we have private ports and let them compete? So there's all of these areas that we talk about in the book where we can have competition. Now, the other part, well, let me stop there and then I'll turn over to innovation if you want to chat a little bit about the competition part of it.
Well, I mean, is the big impediment here the state regulators or
Or you
local?
bet, or it's public ownership. They don't want to give it up. I mean, there's a lot of power when the government owns something, they're not going to say, well, okay, yeah, we'll give this up. We'll give airports up, right? The local authorities don't want to do that. They get
This,
money, they get
this is
power,
true.
whatever. They
This
pay
is true
people.
under Republican, Democratic administrations. It's not really a matter of party; it's a matter of power. You've got local politicians. This is just something they want to be in control of, so they can get some rents of some sort. Maybe they can give
Sure.
assign
I mean,
assign.
the origin of this was the Depression. This happened during the 30s. Aviation was just getting off the ground in this country. The Depression hits. There were airports. They were private. They had huge financial problems. Government came in, could have bailed them out, tried to get them through it. They didn't. They said, we're going to take them over. Same thing I might add, and we'll get to this in a bit, occurred in transit. Transit used to be all private, both trains and buses. Obviously, when the car came along, they started having financial problems, coupled with certain restrictions, by the way, in terms of regulations on their operations. Local government could have helped them out. No, they didn't. They said, we're going to take you over and you're failing and goodbye. So, this is something that we've seen before. The problem is these should be thought about as experiments. Okay, let's try and see if the public sector can do better when the private sector has serious financial problems. We've learned they can't. They can't. I mean, some of these things have got to the point, believe it or not, where they really are socially undesirable. That is, if you look at the magnitude of the subsidies and you compare them with, quote, the social benefits from the users, even accounting for things like, reducing congestion from cars, it's still negative. And that's obviously something people won't look at, but that really is the truth.
So what you're
So,
saying?
so this is the problem. We do have this sort of, very stuck system where public sector is involved, and we continue to have these inefficiencies and lack of competition. But as we talk about in the book, there really are opportunities for competition to improve the
So
system.
I had another guest on. Peter Fox Penner just wrote a book. Uh, let's see. It's called. I'm, I'm I'm blanking on the title. It's Power After. No, it's called Power After Carbon. Anyway, he talks about the potential for green technologies to power the country, and he spends a lot of time talking about the new green grid that we need, grid 2.0, if you like, to transport electricity, that we can't use the old grid in order to fulfill this kind of ambition. But he says he's quite pessimistic because of the local and state regulatory authorities that are blocking building a new power line from wind turbines in Texas to New York City.
That's right.
He points out that you could put on solar panels on every building in Boston, you still wouldn't come up with more than maybe a third of the energy needs. You really need to bring it in. Uh, so, do you see anything in any of these bills that's actually going to improve the grid?
Okay, so this then is the second topic. This is innovation,
Those will have
right?
to be our last topic.
Innovation and
You're going to fix it.
technological change.
Good.
Well, if we know there is nothing worse for innovation and technological change than the government getting involved in this. They're driven by lawyers. There are rules, there are red tape, there are certain things we've got to do. We don't like to take risks. We don't like to experiment. So, this is the mindset. And who's writing a lot of these bills are lawyers. And again, so you hear me being critical of other disciplines, and I have reason to be. I mean, both engineers spend money like crazy. And lawyers write regulations like crazy. And no one steps back and asks, what are we trying to solve? How can we solve this in the most efficient, effective way possible? And are the things that we've been doing the right way to do them? Or can we say, look, there may be a better way to do this? So the bills are not going to all of a sudden change, step back and say, oh, we really ought to innovate differently, which means, by the way, it's not a great idea to have the government involved doing this. No, they'll build on whatever we have before, use good words, but still it's the same problem. The private sector innovates. The public sector does not innovate. The private sector needs incentives and opportunities. Now, this is critical part of my book, because the big innovation coming up on transportation is automation, autonomy. Autonomous vehicles are a game changer. It is absolutely incredible that the Biden administration has put at least some emphasis and attention on electric vehicles and zero on autonomous vehicles. When autonomous vehicles, especially for a Democratic administration, are so important because they can improve mobility for old people, young people, infirmed people. These are the kinds of things that Democrats should care about. Huge ways of raising the quality of life for these people, right? Nothing is said. There's just cynicism. There's attacks every time, GM had a problem. They're suspicious of Waymo. No one's sort of saying just how important all of this is and what he can do. And again, back to my earlier point, the full cost of distance. What do you think autonomy can do for reducing the full cost of distance? Out of pocket costs, boom, you don't have a driver anymore. Probably not even insurance, right? You'll get there quicker, less congestion, more reliability, and of course, safety. This is it right here.
What's your thinking on the grid? Look, we're gonna have to probably end
So
this.
anyway, yeah, I mean, the grid is the same thing. I mean, there's no one with a vision. That's really what it is. There's no one with a vision of what are the most important things, right? Where we need to have the capacity, particularly on the electric and autonomous side. That's where we're going to need it, right? Electric vehicles are going to need this,
Right.
all this kind of stuff. Wind too. I mean, there are problems with all these alternative energy sources, but there's no vision of where to do this. And I don't think the firms themselves, especially in this area, are sufficiently established to sort of say, okay, here's exactly how we do it. Let us take it over. It's not like with airlines. This is sort of the big joke. You're reading with the Boeing business that, now FAA and NTSB are looking into it. This is a joke. They don't know anything. Boeing will tell FAA and NTSB how their aircraft works, what went wrong. FAA and NTSB will repeat this and make it look like they had some influence on improving safety. Okay. That's what they're going to say. That's how it works publicly, but it's not how it works. Boeing knows what their problems are. What we need is private sector expertise to tell the government, look, this is how we need to do things to improve the grid and so on and so forth. Keep out of the way other than write checks if we need any. Other than that, you've done your job.
I got it. So, well, this is listen. I learned more listening to you than to any transportation secretary in in my lifetime, to tell you the truth, just in an hour. And I really want to appreciate, and you're coming, or so thank you for coming. And I'm hoping that whoever is elected the next president will choose you for transportation secretary. Have you had any contact with any of the political parties or candidates?
I'm not quite sure that I'm the kind of personality type they're looking for. I think there are people who are well suited for government. To be honest with you, I'm not even well suited for an economics department. I'm better off by myself.
Actually, I think what we need is a government of technocrats at this point. We've seen the politicians and the lawyers make
Yes.
such a mess of
Oh,
so
yeah.
many things. If you look at Social Security, it has 12 benefits. I'll just give you an analogy here. 12 benefits. 2,728 rules in its handbook. That's the basic rules about the 12 benefits. Then there's 20,000 plus pages, if you print it out, of the program operating manual system about the 2,728 rules about the 12 benefits. And then there's a supplemental program operating manual system, which you can't even access publicly, about the 20,000 pages about the 2,728 rules about the 12 benefits. New Zealand has one rule. It is you reach 65, you get a check. It's the same check for everybody. Done deal. It's not this vast bureaucracy. Social Security has something like 60,000 employees, and 2,000 people are being, according to Social Security, called back every year. They finally revealed this because their Social Security is claiming that they've been overpaying them potentially for decades. We've seen clawbacks that go back to 45 years. Uh, so they can't shoot remotely straight. And it's all these rules were all written by lawyers.
Oh, yeah.
So Shakespeare had it right. First
Right.
shoot lawyers, uh, and then maybe shoot the politicians. But anyway, leave
And if
the
we talk about privatizing Social Security, take their heads off.
exactly. Yeah. The anyway, great to have you.
Okay, good to
We'll
talk
be
with
in
you.
touch, and I'm hoping that one of these candidates will see this podcast and grab you as their transportation person, because it's great to have somebody speak frankly about what the heck's going on and what we really need. So thanks again.
Great.
And
Enjoy talking with you. Good seeing you again.